Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we continue our mission in part 2. Let's get started. Welcome back to part 2 of this two-part episode. For anyone who hasn't heard our last episode, please pause here, go back to the last episode. It really has to be listened in conjunction with both. The reason that it needs to be heard with both is because this two-part podcast episode is going to talk about the recent mission that I was on to Israel with a number of educators, and I kind of described why we were going and what we were doing. So if you have not heard that, some of this might not make any sense, and it really needs to be heard together. For those of you who did hear my last podcast episode, I appreciate you sticking around for the second half of this. I'll be honest, I've actually put off recording this for quite some time. I was really eager after the last one to try and get all my thoughts down as soon as possible while they were still fresh, but I just couldn't force myself to sit down and put this to words because the last one was tough emotionally. It was really hard to do, and this one I think is going to be even harder. So for those of you who did listen to the last one, you understand that the content in this episode also is going to be very difficult. Please take your time. If you need to pause and take a moment, that's totally understandable. It is not easy content. And so just as a warning for anyone who has children in the car or when you listen, please make sure that they are likely not in the room. It's very difficult. So listener discretion is advised. In our last episode, we ended after going to some of the sites and hearing some of the stories of the events of October 7th. If you remember, we started with some background knowledge. Then we saw the events of the day, and now we're moving on to sort of the day after the events of October 7th. Not that the country is really fully moved on. Israel is still on October 7th because nothing's really been done. We're sort of frozen in time. But in the sense of after October 7th, we were dealing with hostages, deaths, things of that nature after the fact. And this was the focus of the day that we started on day 3. The first thing we did was we went to what is now commonly referred to as Hostage Square. Many of you probably have seen photos of this video. I don't want to call it a place for tourists because it really isn't. It's just sort of a grassroots natural monument that's been created by the people who are missing family members, people who have lost somebody, and the artist community. This happens to be, number one, right across the street from the Ministry of Defense, but number two, right in front of an artist's gallery. So it's these two juxtaposed things where we want to talk about hostages to the ministry, but they decided to use artistic license, we'll call it, in that square. Again, just like last week, if you go onto my Instagram account, jdr.podcast, you're going to see a lot of photos and videos. You could see a lot of the amazing installments that were created. This included the very famous or infamous table that everyone has been seeing since about 9 months ago. Many of you may recall the white, beautiful table with the china waiting in that square, very long for all of the hostages to come home. This was initially put in to think you'll be home soon and it's waiting for you. This table is here for your next Shabbat. You will be here. Let's get ready to celebrate. But unfortunately, it seems like 9 months later, not a lot of things have changed in the sense of hostage rescues. There was, of course, some people who did get out after 50 or so days. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there are far too many now that have not come home. And the artists who create these artistic pieces decided that the table didn't really suit the situation. This beautiful white linen and all of the beautiful china didn't fit what people were feeling right now. And so if you look at the photo, you'll see that the artist decided to make it look a little bit more like what the hostages in Gaza are dealing with, rather than this idealized, when you get out, we'll be waiting for you kind of table. So if you look at the photos, you'll now see that the table has been turned completely gray. It is not nice. All of the cutlery and china have been removed. Everything has been damaged. The seats that used to be nicely curated, waiting for people, have now turned into cement bags and cinder blocks and benches made out of wood. There's even a high chair waiting for the young Bibas boy, and it's been completely turned gray and black and dirty like it's been burned. It's representing this unfortunate reality that these people have been living in hell for over 200 days, and it was really hard to see. There were many, many things. Again, go back to my Instagram, take a look at it. But another one that you'll notice is someone created an artistic version of the tunnel system where you can actually walk through. And when you walk through, it's got sounds of what the tunnels probably sound like. Maybe this is based on survivor testimony, but it's dark. There's water droplets. You hear screaming. You hear booms and bangs and gunshots from all directions. It was very powerful because, we know that you have an exit at the end. It's only a few, maybe 10 feet long. But the people who are down there don't know when they're ever coming out or if they'll ever come out. These artistic pieces really do show a country not only really in mourning and not really frozen in time and not sure what to do with these feelings and these emotions, but a country that honestly doesn't really know how to feel about all of this. It is so crazy to think that this has lasted so long and they don't know how to deal with it. One of the last things that we were told by our tour guide while we were there was the fact that there's this huge LED wall that has a timer on there for how long people have been in captivity. And he said one of the most tragic things was when they had certain amount of LED panels to make up the sign, but they had to add an entire row to add the extra day once it passed the 100th day. We had to add an LED panel to get that 100th number, which is just something no one ever expected. And it was a really stark reality to show everyone how long it's been. With the mood set, leaving Hostage Square, we walked over to a building known as the Bring Them Home Group or Foundation. Not sure exactly how they call themselves. Most of us know them as Bring Them Home Now. This is an official organization now. Many of you have seen their posts. All of those posters that all of you have seen all over that are being ripped down by crazy people, those are all created and designed by the Bring Them Home Group. These are all volunteers. These are people who either have family members that have been affected or just want to help out. There are 3 or 4 floors dedicated, donated, by the way, by a very important Israeli company, gave them the space for free, and they come in and they work to bring the hostages home. And it's tireless work. Not only does this group help people get back from Gaza, but also they help the families, and they make sure that the families are taken care of. They have people like medical staff on board for mental health reasons, for the families, for the hostages that are rescued when they come back, and the PTSD and all of these other things they're dealing with. The amount of time and effort and concern that's going on in this building is nothing short of heroic. And the funny thing they said about this was that it wasn't really organized. It was just literally a bunch of hostage families got together and started working towards the same goal of getting their loved ones back. And then it turned into a formal organization of just volunteers. This is the heart and the soul of Israel. People who are just doing what they can to help others and not really needing a plan. It didn't need to be official. We didn't need a board of people deciding what we're doing in our direction and our mission statement. We just did whatever we needed to do to get our people back. We were very fortunate, if we can call it that, to have a discussion with someone who worked there, who eventually brought in the family member of somebody who was held hostage, so we can hear her story. The reason why we couldn't hear it from the person directly was because she's a 13-year-old girl, and the trauma that she's facing is unimaginable. So we heard from her cousin, who told us what had happened. And I'm going to share that story with you right now. As always, listener discretion is advised. This is very difficult to talk about. We heard from the cousin of Gali. Gali is a 13-year-old girl who was kidnapped and held in captivity for 54 days in Hamas captivity. Some of you may know Gali because Gali was one of the first people that was on video being released by the stupid International Red Cross who did nothing to get them back or to check on their safety. But as part of the deal, they did the taxi service, bringing them from Gaza to Egypt and then from Egypt to Israel. But many of you may notice this young girl who left and jumped out of the van with a huge smile on her face, which ironically, people said was proof that they were treated so well in captivity. This is Gali, a loving, happy, young 13-year-old girl who lived on Kibbutz Be'eri. And many of you have heard the story from Kibbutz Be'eri in my last episode, the horrors and tragedy that went on there. This is the same kibbutz that she was on that day. Gully and her brother and her father were at home in Kibbutz Be'eri on the October 7th morning. Her parents are unfortunately divorced, so she was staying with her father that day with her brother. Her mother was somewhere else on the kibbutz. And at 6:30 in the morning, as you heard in my last episode, the rockets go off. And like everyone else on the kibbutz and in the entire southern Israel, they get to their shelters, which is something that's very normal for them, unfortunately. They're used to it. However, like many people, they described the fact that something was odd. This usually 5 or 10-minute procedure ended up being 20 and 30 minutes, and they knew something was wrong. Something was different this time. They were in their shelter for an hour, and like the other stories before, they were getting WhatsApp messages from their group chats about people in Be'eri, terrorists are there, they're trying to get into our houses, things like that, just like in our last story. And they did the same thing that everybody did. They did the battle for the door handle. If you remember from my last podcast, this is a theme of October 7th. The rocket shelters that are built into every home don't have locks, so the father of the two kids holds on for dear life, tries to hold that door shut to make sure that nobody can come in. Her father, that's described as a quite large man, her cousin likened him to a Viking, big, burly man, was holding this door shut as hard as he could. And he did it so well that the Hamas terrorists couldn't get in. And out of frustration, out of anger, out of just pure hate for Jewish people, they decided to light the house on fire because they wanted to give them the choice. You either come out and die or be kidnapped, or you die in your shelter because we are setting the house on fire. Her cousin described the father telling them to jam blankets and shirts and anything they could find into the doorframe in hopes to keep the smoke out. They tried their best. Unfortunately, that didn't work. The smoke was getting too much and it was coming in. Slowly, all of a sudden, Gali and her brother were realizing that the smoke was filling up the room. Their father was still holding the door as hard as he could to make sure that nobody would be coming in, but the smoke was overtaking them. Her cousin describes Gali and her brother's relationship like best friends. And when her brother started telling her and her father that he was feeling sick and nauseous and feeling like he needed to pass out, Gali said to him, "Let me hold your hand, and if you feel like you're getting a little sick or going to pass out, squeeze my hand," because they couldn't really see each other through the smoke that was filling the room. And for a few times, every time he squeezed her hand, she would shake him to wake him up. And eventually, it got to the point where his grip was so weak that she said to her father that she wants to open the window to the shelter. The father begrudgingly agrees and says, "We have to open the window. The son is dying. The smoke is getting so bad, we're all going to die." So she very lightly and quickly opens up just a little bit to get a little bit of air in. And it's described that the minute that window opens, all of a sudden gunfire comes through. And unfortunately, the father, who's been holding the door for 13 hours, is shot in the arm. She immediately closes the window and doesn't know what to do. The smoke is filling up. Her brother is now passed out. Her father now shot. She can't deal with it anymore. This is a 13-year-old girl. And she says to her father, "We need to get out of here." So she tells her father, "I'm going to jump out the window when I find an opening, and I'm going to run as fast as I can. You take your son, my brother, and go out to the woods somewhere and save yourselves. I'll run the opposite direction." And this is what they did. And Gully jumps out the window and, according to her cousin, lands on the ground thinking that there's no one around, but sees in a little bit of a distance around the corner a Hamas terrorist with a gun to her dog's head. And he shoots the dog in the head. Gully froze. She was in total shock. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't run. She couldn't scream, and was just standing there until the Hamas person took her and held her until she went into captivity. After Gully got back, she described to her cousin and other family members what she had seen. According to the 13-year-old girl who was being held by Hamas, what would happen was they would keep everyone together and then take you all as a group. So she was forced to stand around while they were gathering up more people to take hostage. She describes watching people being raped right in the streets in front of their husbands and then shot. Then the husbands being shot. She described the Hamas terrorists being inside of houses and going into the fridge, taking food, taking drinks, turning on the television because they wanted to see the news coverage on Israeli TV of all the massacres that were going on. And worst of all, she said that they actually went on and started playing with kids' PlayStations. They had so much time to sit around and wait to get more and more hostages out of houses that they had set on fire, that they were sitting in houses playing video games. Eventually, Gali was taken to Gaza and put into the tunnels and various places. We didn't really hear too much about where she was during captivity. Apparently, she has not yet described to many people what has gone on in captivity. She did describe having very little food and water and coming back with lice and not being able to have showered or taken any kind of care of her hygiene. We can't imagine what she saw and what she went through. But we do know that her father survived. He did make it to a wooded area until the IDF showed up and they were able to take him to a hospital to fix his arm that had been shot. Unfortunately, her brother had died of smoke inhalation, and eventually, after that first hostage negotiation deal after 50 plus days, they had to tell Gully when she came home that her brother and best friend was dead. To this day, her father and her mother are taking good care of her, trying to deal with the aftermath of this disgusting and horrible situation. We wish her, honestly, a full recovery, and hopefully she'll do okay. On a happier note, if any of you are keeping up with the news, apparently some of the hostages and people who were affected by October 7th in Israel were recently taken by donations to Disneyland in America, and happily Gali was one of them. So she was able to go to Disneyland and forget about her trauma and her troubles for even a brief minute. I guess you can call this, in a way, a good ending, in the sense that she survived, she got out. Not everybody, unfortunately, has been lucky enough to get their loved ones home. And then there's people who, unfortunately, never survived. Later that day, we went and spoke with a number of people who had loved ones that, unfortunately, didn't survive October 7th. And here's the story of Adi Vital Kaplun, 33, a Canadian who moved to Israel many years ago. Adi was an amazing person who her parents describe as strong-willed and was willing to do anything and everything to get whatever her goal was. When she decided to make Aliyah and move to Israel, she went down south with her boyfriend and then husband to go live near the Gaza border because they wanted to get into farming and working the land like the original pioneers of Israel. And this was the best place to do it. Now, they didn't just go and join a kibbutz like many other people. They created their own kibbutz with their friends. They literally set up from scratch farms and homes, and it took so much effort and discipline and will to have that happen. And it goes to show her character. Adi and her husband have 2 beautiful children. One is 4 years old, and one is a younger baby. And by most standards, they had a wonderful, happy life. On the morning of October 7th, really, really early before sunrise, her husband was going on a pre-planned hike with a number of his friends to go watch the sunrise and have a few coffees on a mountaintop somewhere. So he had left. Unfortunately, that's the day that Hamas decides to shoot rockets at 6:30 in the morning. So he and his friends are hunkering down on a mountaintop somewhere, and Adi and her 2 children are going into a shelter. This seems normal. As everyone has said, it happens every day when you live southern Israel near the border. They're used to it. But again, after some time, unfortunately, things weren't normal. Adi starts getting messages from people on WhatsApp, from people in her community and in other communities, and she realizes what's going on. So she calls her husband on his cell phone and tells him what's going on. He is too far away to help. And so Adi, being what I would call and what her parents call the lioness, the protective mother and strong-willed person, asked her husband, "Where is your gun from when you're in the army? And please give me like a crash course on how to use it." So she grabs the gun, the M16 rifle that he uses in the army. She unlocks it, she loads it, he walks her through how to use it, and she takes the gun and she goes into the safe room and holds the door shut in the battle of the door handle. A small wrinkle in this very difficult story to begin with is the fact that Adi's father, the man who is telling us this story, who survived, was there with her, but not in the same place. As I mentioned in my previous episode, kibbutzes usually have guest houses. When your family comes from out of town, when your family lives somewhere else in Israel, there's little sort of hotel rooms, we'll call it. And so you can stay over for the night. Her father was staying with her that weekend because her mother was in Canada visiting some friends and family, and her father was there about 20 feet away. So she calls her father, and what he describes as an incredible act of bravery. Her father works with the police, but wasn't really on duty. He's retired. She calls him and tells him what's going on because he wouldn't have the WhatsApp group chat that she was privy to. And she told him to go into his safe room in that guest suite. He begged her as a police officer, as a father, as a grandfather. He said, I'm going to come over, which is just across the way a little bit, and be with you right now and keep you guys safe or help protect you. And she said, in a way that he described as nothing short of heroic, she said, no, get into your shelter and stay there. And she hung up the phone on him. He said that he felt like there was no arguing with her. The way she said it, he knew that she meant business and he wasn't going to argue. So he stayed in his shelter. And Adi prepared for the worst. She had her children sitting in the back as far as they could in the shelter, and she watched the door. She held that door handle and wasn't going to let it go no matter what. According to what we found out later, there was obviously a battle for the door handle, and like in other cases, we heard in Be'eri and other places, after the Hamas terrorists couldn't get in to the door because she was holding it shut, they decided they were going to try and shoot through the door and shoot through the wall. And they did. And the bullets made it through. But Adi didn't get hit. But she obviously realized that the door wouldn't stop bullets, which works both ways. And she had an M16. So she shoots through the door, and we find out later that she killed at least one Hamas terrorist on the other side of the door. Because later they found his body dragged away from the door while the other terrorists tried to then continue to get into the room. We don't exactly know how it happened, but somehow they did eventually get the door open, and that's the end we hear about Adi and the boys. The father, who's only 20 feet or so away in a different place, says that he's hearing all of the shouting, all of the screaming, he's hearing bullets going off and people shooting, and he doesn't know what's going on. He says it sounds like it's coming from the direction of his daughter's place, and he was waiting for them to come to his. But he said that it's very likely that these people had insider information. The Hamas terrorists didn't enter or even try to enter his unit. The reason being because it is a guest suite, and these people had a list of where everybody lived, who was home, what units have children, what units have dogs. And because his was a unit for guests, they didn't think anyone would be there. So they never entered his unit, thankfully for him. But he was forced to listen to what he assumed was the massacre of his family. Eventually, after far too long, the IDF shows up and they let the father out. They get him out of the unit. He says, my daughter lives across this road here. Can we go check, please? Let's go check. And the IDF breaks into the home of Adi, see that there's a dead Hamas terrorist on the floor, go to the safe room, and there's nobody in there. Her father thinks the worst. He doesn't know if they're dead or alive, if they've been kidnapped. The children are gone, Adi is gone, and they don't know what happened. Many of you might remember this somewhat interesting video clip that was hanging around social media, it was on the news, of this young woman with two kids that weren't her own. This was Adi's children. We found out later that one of the neighbors, a young woman whose husband had just been killed by Hamas and was being taken to Gaza, they just handed her these two boys and said, take them. And so knowing that these boys were her friend's kids, she wanted to take care of them. And she wrapped them up as best she could. And she started walking with these Hamas terrorists back towards Gaza. According to the woman who survived, she describes it as horrible. The 4-year-old son, Negev, had been shot in the foot during the scuffle and couldn't and wouldn't walk. She's holding on to a baby who's crying uncontrollably. She says that you could tell that the smoke inhalation and the gunpowder that's in his lungs is just causing him so much discomfort, coughing and having endless problems with his nose. And she's walking towards Gaza with these kids. And thank goodness, eventually the Hamas terrorists who had many other people they were planning on taking into Gaza were so frustrated with these crying children, with the children not wanting to walk, that they just essentially kept walking and didn't really stop to go get the children and this woman, essentially leaving them behind. So this woman then walks back towards Israel from the Gaza border. There's a video you could see today of this woman going to pick up Negev, the young kid who'd been shot in the foot, and he won't put any pressure down on his foot because he'd been shot. And she takes them back towards Israel and to safety. The mother of Adi described this to us as the most shocking thing she's ever seen. She was in Canada watching the attack unfold like everyone else around the world and seeing her own grandson on the border of Gaza, and at this point had no idea what happened with her daughter either, and was left for days without knowing. At this point, there was still no sign of Adi. They didn't know where she was. The government and the IDF did a tracker on her cell phone and found that it was inside Gaza. So the worst was thought, that she had been taken captive. They had the kids back, thankfully. They were checked out and helped in whatever medical way they needed to be helped. The father eventually came to the hospital to get his sons, but there was no sign of Adi, and there was a huge push to try and get her back. The family even contacted the Canadian government to seek help because she was a Canadian citizen, and they did nothing to help. Unfortunately, a couple days later, as they're going through the kibbutz to find any kind of survivors, find any kind of victims, clean up the mess, as many of you might know, in Judaism, you have to bury every piece of the body, including any kind of blood. So that group called Zaka, which many people have seen talking about what they see in these massacres, have to go in. And little did they realize when they got to the safe room of Adi's house that underneath the bed, hiding, was Adi's body. And she had been killed by Hamas on the day of October 7th. And that's when they took the boys. In something I can probably not describe other than, I don't know, insult on top of injury. I don't even know how to describe this. The Hamas terrorists, apparently, when they put her body underneath the bed, put 50 live grenades under her body. So that way, when anyone tried to pull her out, they too would be killed. And thankfully, because of the understanding that this was happening by the IDF, they were able to disarm those 50 grenades and have a body to bury. And the people who were dealing with the body didn't get hurt. But this is the kind of sick thinking that these people have, to booby trap bodies. Adi's family obviously is unbelievably pained by the events that day. Her father survived and was able to tell us about it, and to tell you that this man and his wife were not the most happy, loving, caring people you've ever met is an understatement. Hugging and kissing every person in this group as if each and every one of us was their own children, as a feeling of gratitude for coming and sharing in their story and being able to share their daughter's story. I can't explain it. The only thing I can think of to explain it is my own grandparents. Two people who survived the Holocaust and lost their entire families, but somehow were the most loving and caring human beings you would ever meet. I wouldn't even have blamed them for being bitter and angry and feeling like the world owed them a living. But they, and Adi's parents, couldn't possibly be more loving and caring and always had a smile on their face. Really, there's no explanation for this. I can't explain it. There were so many more stories that we heard that unfortunately I don't have the time to share with you. Very tragic in every way. The death of a Jewish person, or frankly a person in general, but in this case these Jewish people, is like an entire world. In Judaism we believe that literally one life is like an entire world. And when you save one life, you save an entire world. And it's just tragic to see all of these lives cut short. A mother trying to save and protect her children. A young girl trying to protect and save her brother and her father. It's without words. It was so difficult. This whole trip really was a challenge emotionally. Closer to the last days of our trip, we made one last stop at a very important place in Israel, and that is called Mount Herzl. Mount Herzl is the national cemetery. For my American friends, that would be something like Arlington National Cemetery. And we went there to see the heroes who have unfortunately given their lives to protect the people of Israel. And what might be unusual, I've never been to Arlington, but in Har Herzl or Mount Herzl, it is extremely common for people to be there visiting their loved ones. And it's also very common for these people to want to share their family members who've passed stories. It is a way for them to keep living on. And when we were there, we actually saw a few very interesting graves. And I'll explain a few of them to you very briefly. The first grave that we saw was of Anar Shapira. Some of you may not recognize that name, but I'm sure you recognize what he did. There's a video on social media and has gone viral of a young man who's in one of the bomb shelters, standing in the doorway while many people were huddled in the back corner trying to stay safe from Hamas terrorists. And every time that Hamas would throw in multiple grenades, this young man stood up and actually caught all of the grenades and threw them back out at Hamas, keeping everybody else safe at a massive risk to his own life. He was able to throw out 7 grenades successfully. And unfortunately, the 8th took his life. And it actually took his best friend's hand. Many of you know Hirsch Goldberg Polin, the American who lost his hand and is now in Hamas captivity for far too long. Next to him was the grave of a young man whose father and mother were there. And they told us the story of their son Yosef and how he broke off from one of his missions that he was supposed to be on and went to go and save as many people as he could. He and his friends drove across the country to get to the kibbutzim and was running in and out with his Jeep trying to get survivors and bring them out to safety. He and his friends laid down cover fire in order to make sure that they were safe as they came in and out. And unfortunately, on the 4th attempt to get people out, his Jeep was hit with an RPG and he was sadly killed. But this wasn't, unfortunately, the end of the story, because his fellow soldiers who were standing guard saw the Hamas terrorists trying to take the body into Gaza. And those soldiers protected him from a distance. Anybody who tried to take his body, they killed immediately until he was finally able to be rescued. And he was brought back to his family where he was buried in that cemetery where we were standing. And his family showed us a photo. It is on our Instagram account. He had just been married a year earlier, and his wife is now a widow. But he saved many lives of soldiers and civilians on that day. And while we're listening to this tragic and terrible story, our mission leader happens to see another father sitting by a grave all by himself. And she went over and said that she wanted to join him to say a prayer. The more people who are praying for this person who passed, the better. And so she says her prayers with him. And then he tells the story of his son. And his son, you might already know, but you don't realize it. His son's name is Adir Tahar, and he was a soldier. And on October 7th, he went and he was trying to protect the country of Israel. And many of you may have heard the story of, after being killed, the Hamas terrorists cut his head off with a garden tool. It turns out that this person who had this head decided to try and sell it for the equivalent of $10,000 in Gaza. He tried to sell a person's head because it, to them, was a trophy that could be sold. Thankfully, the IDF, when they went into Rafah, the place that the world said don't go into Rafah, they found his head in an ice cream shop's freezer, waiting to be sold. He was able to get his son's entire body back in order to bury it, and here he was, sitting at the grave of his son, where we heard his story. In the end, I really can't summarize the entire trip. It is very emotional. It's too big emotionally to try and describe in a short, brief couple sentences. It was obviously incredibly powerful. It really put a face to the name and connected things that I had seen on video with an actual place in the world. And I think that that connection was so important. For example, this past week at synagogue, when we do our prayers for those who are in Gaza, for those who have been hurt, for those who are in captivity, for the soldiers, these are all things we do essentially since the beginning of this conflict. And yet, this time, for the first time since getting back, when I was saying those prayers, I actually started to cry because I could put a face to the name of hostages, of those families who told us their stories, of people who are in captivity, for the people who were killed on October 7th. Being able to put a face to a name makes it so much more realistic. You can just visualize that one person, and it symbolizes many, many other people who are in that same situation. Going on this trip was so unbelievably important, especially seeing how the news media and social media likes to literally ignore everything and spin everything and make essentially false claims claiming to be real. You have to see it for yourself. In this day and age, with social media and with what used to be trusted news sources clearly not being trusted or frankly news anymore, they're kind of like opinion stations and propaganda machines. Honestly, you have to go yourself. And not that I'm suggesting that anybody should go. If anyone wants to go and see and live it for yourself, please feel free. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to have gone, because now I can say that I was there, that I was witness to these things. I heard the stories. I've seen the places. And when I tell people about it, and I plan on it, not only this podcast, but I'm hoping to go and speak at events, bring my photos, and tell people what I saw. Because if you can't go yourself, you need someone who was there, who can attest to these things and not rely on media, social media videos, whatever it might be. But one of the things that I was kind of surprised about, that I would feel so differently, is many of you who've listened to this podcast before know that I love to troll the trolls on social media. I have so many people who write really dumb comments. They like to, do the Free Palestine thing or make stupid propaganda claims, we'll call it, under your posts in comment sections. I used to have fun with them. I used to like to fool around and make fun of them and make them look really stupid and whatever. That was normal and common for me. But one weird feeling I had after this was all done was that I'm not really interested in doing that anymore. I feel like this isn't really as much of a joke as it used to be. Like, we knew the events were terrible, don't get me wrong, but these people making claims that it never happened and whatever, like, I used to joke around with them, like, to prove how stupid they were. But I'm not really in the mood for joking anymore. This is way too serious and way too personal now to be kind of making light of someone who makes light of this, if that makes sense. And that's kind of over with. I don't know if I can do that anymore. For those of you who made it this far through this podcast, through the last two, thank you for listening. It means the world to me. It means the world to the people of Israel. It means the world to these families who shared with us and took the very difficult step of reliving their trauma just so we can hear it, so that way we can pass it on to as many people as possible. If you have any other questions or comments or feedback on these hard topics, please feel free to message us on our Instagram at jdr.podcast and let us know what you think. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.